Hello and welcome to the Tonearm, where we connect you with the people and ideas moving culture forward. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today we're putting the Tonearm's needle on drummer Phil Haynes. Since moving to New York from Oregon in 1983, Phil's played on scores of recordings with artists like Anthony Braxton and David Liebman. Phil joined me once already, back in March of 2024, to discuss his memoir, Chasing the Masters, First Takes of a Modernist Drumming Artist. There's a link to that in the show notes. Phil's with me today to discuss his band Free Country, who take American roots music and run it through their particular jazz lens, using cello, guitar, bass, and drums to create something they call jazzgrass. Their new album, Liberty Now, did not set out to be political. Phil planned for the group to record original compositions, a departure from their previous work. But then the last U.S. presidential election happened, and then the band got word of the passing of their trumpeter, Herb Robertson. In fact, they got that word just as they walked into the studio. The music and the plan changed. Phil paired the new recordings with songs from Free Country's catalog into a double album that runs from Revolutionary War tunes to What a Wonderful World. Phil's here to talk about grief, protest, making art when the ground shifts underneath you, and one of my favorite topics, the role of music in addressing contemporary political and social challenges. So now, here's my conversation with Phil Haynes. When Free Country went into the studio at the beginning of this project late last year, you thought you were making a different record, right?
Yes.
I'm curious if you could tell me about the album you thought you were making and how it transformed into the album you made.
Well, it was, I kind of thought 10 years ago, Free Country had run its course because, after the success of the first one, which was recorded, or artistic success and critical success of the first one, clear back in 1997, got released a couple years later, and it was done the day after I was married, and we had some people, from around the world that were all in fans, so it made sense if, they were there for the record, and our timing worked out with the wedding, and Dee was at the studio with us, and all that, and then I realized at the time of making the first record that it was really needed to be the start of an American trilogy. The first one was Free Country, was mostly pre-1900 music. And then the second one, The Way the West Was Won, was mostly, from 1900 through 1950s, American Hollywood soundtracks, Aaron Copland, what have you. And then, of course, my favorite thing, 60-69, which was the decade of the 60s, everything from Burt Bacharach to Coltrane. So it was like, well, without a label investing in the band, I mean, we certainly would have made one of Motown or whatever it might have been. It was meant to be a band that could communicate jazz ideals in a really NPR-friendly kind of, that was the original thought of it. But of course, I picked the right guys so that it was honest romanticism in everybody. And the band grew, and it became clear from the beginning that there was this, we had to have political discussions about all of it. I remember, I used to think that, gee, if it was a good melody and, it was American, well, then we ought to do it. And then Hank Roberts said, do you really think that 4 white guys ought to be recording certain of these tunes? I was like, oh, no, that's right. We probably cannot. And so this band was a political awakening, I think, for all of us, because you can imagine the conversations that went on. Anyway, without major label support, which I kind of always had hoped somebody would pick up the mantle, I thought it was over. And then the sound of the band for the last 10 years never went out of my head. Reflecting on COVID, trying to figure out what I could do. And as I searched for very much younger generation collaborators, I realized that the only thing I could do immediately were things that maybe some unfinished business. And I had always thought if we were ever to make another record and I was going to finance it, it would be of our music. Instead of being a cover band, which the band was brilliant at, let's take that sound, let's take that heritage, let's take that chemistry and turn it to our own tune. So it was supposed to be Free Country, quote unquote, our music. And that's what we went into the studio, long and short, last December to do. And then, of course, the election intervened and personal loss. Herb Robertson passed. We literally found out as we were loading into the studio, et cetera. Just one thing after another. But I don't think I realized it was a protest record until a couple of months later when I started going through the material.
I want to come back to that point in a moment, but you brought up Herb Robertson. In our last talk, you had this great line that I wanted to read back to you, and maybe you've said it elsewhere, but I'm going to pretend it was special for me. And you said there's Phil Haynes before Herb Robertson and Phil Haynes after. That's that's heavy. I wonder if you could unpack a little bit for me about what a story, right? You're loading into the studio, you get that news. How does that impact what results?
Well, you can imagine it was huge because each of us, Hank, Drew, and Jim and I, had all recorded with Herb individually over the years, over decades. He was not only a close friend and colleague, he happened to be, at least for me, one of the ways that it struck me, besides, of course, out of the blue, it struck me because he was the first important person I considered in my generation to pass. And I mean, important artist. He helped to change our generation in such a way that now it doesn't seem to matter whether you're into avant jazz, avant classical music, progressive rock, hillbilly music, what everybody knows about open improv. And when I got to New York in the early mid 80s, when I met Herb Robertson, it was like, oh, that's what free is. I had been labeled free, but I didn't know what free was. He could take the most common, literally dime store toys, never meant to be instruments, and he saw in them their potential and then revealed their potential as serious music instruments. And at first, this he called it ritual music, not free music, because he saw that we needed to come to it out of silence, out of respect, trying to become vessels for something greater, to get ourselves out of the way and thus sort of refresh ourselves in a greater community. And that greater community, of course, is accessible through the subconscious. Well, anyway, he could make music. I used to joke that, well, if the worst happens and, there's only a burning hulk of the Empire State Building left, if Herb Robertson's there, he could play a solo concert on that and people would come around and cheer. He had that ability to take anything and make music on it. I never saw anything like it, but it affected me. And he did it usually, it wasn't just that you came out of silence, it was the quietest sounds. And all of a sudden, things that I had been doing when I was in hotel rooms trying to not be heard or whatever, all of a sudden, these things that I had been doing that I just thought were experiments and ways to keep myself creative in restrictive circumstances, all of a sudden, they were opened as this, it was like this magic curtain opened. And he opened that for many of us. And of course, in his prime, he was a great lead trumpet player. He could read bird droppings, as we used to say, on manuscript paper. And then he also had this ability to play, oh, so that's what free music is. It was the most both spiritual and sort of community democratic and also self-revealing music I had ever been around. And then I noticed if there were two of us in the room that had been affected by him, then the whole ensemble all of a sudden was just way more sensitive and way more willing to improvise, to take chances, to take what is instead of what I'm trying to make happen. That was great.
When you describe him, I'm trying to reflect back some of the things I'm hearing. There's a musicality, there's a sensitivity. And when you describe free music or what you saw in free music from him, it seems like there's a willingness to be vulnerable, right? Because that's kind of scary to pick up an object and decide it's going to be musical.
Yes. I had a teacher, my first teacher in, I think it was fourth grade, finally talked my parents into drum lessons. He had a lot of problems. He was not very good, as it turned out. I had a lot of issues afterwards. But I remember one thing that he said, and I learned from, he said, "That's a wrong sound." I knew what he was trying to say, even though in my fourth grade language I didn't have it, but I understood intuitively that, oh, that's out of context. What he really meant to say was that was out of context. And my whole life, I've been trying to take sounds Because percussionists are sound generators and orchestrators. And can I frame it so that it's musical? And not just musical like a sound effect, but musical as lyricism, as harmony, as part of the main story, not just the background, or part of the background, not just part of the main story. Trying to raise the percussive arts in my own small way. Yeah, to be an equal with these amazing composers and horn players and pianists and right, all of that. I mean, we have an inferiority complex. I think it goes along with vocalists, right? But you said it, vulnerability. That's one of the things that I think my buddy Jim Yonda in Free Country, he always feels vulnerable. And I said, but that's what's so great about your playing. You do find yourself taking chances, and it isn't easy for self-acceptance. And yet, when it's that human, when it's that sincere, when it's got that kind of earnest wisdom, real romanticism instead of some kind of schmaltzer looking back and, oh, isn't that cute? No, this is who he is. And I mean, this is what you try to strive for as an artist. Can I be completely translucent and completely vulnerable and inspiring to others to be their best? This band has done that for each of us. Hank Roberts or Drew Gress are on so many great things. I don't think you'll ever find them on anything better.
Yeah.
Oh, it's different, right? But they play brilliantly, as does Jim with this band. Each of us managed to frame each other one of our most flattering ways. And that doesn't always happen. You try to put friends together, you try to put colleagues together, what's the sound going to sound like before we put it together? But you never really know until you do. And then if you do it over years, when you find out that something good happened initially, which it certainly did, I was like, oh, it does grow. And then let me just say, when Herb passed and we all got the news, none of us felt like playing. And yet we knew we had to. This project had been postponed twice for various reasons. And, and months and years, right? And so this was the time we were all here, and Herb would have wanted us to play. And then what came out? You said the word vulnerable. The music has a vulnerability and a translucency to that isn't common. We're all professionals, and I'm going to bring my craft to bear, and going to honor this composer, whether it's the guys in the room or whoever it is. And next thing you know, you're stripped down to your basic humanity, and that can be inspiring when it's right.
Something I admire in this music, and especially reflected in this album, is the transcending or even the sublimating. I don't know what the right word is, but it's almost a new genre. The Americana meeting the spirit of jazz, or the facility of jazz players playing. It seems authentically American. This music seems authentically American. Now, a lot of that's the context that has been brought to it because of the song selections in the past. And, it's hard to divorce from all that, but that's the conclusion I come to. And I'm curious, did you ever hear the record that Yo-Yo Ma made with Chris Thiele and I think Edgar Meyer? It was Goat Rodeo Sessions. Did you ever hear those records?
No, I didn't hear the records, but I heard some of that because they were performing in areas that I would, and they played some of that material. Edgar and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the ethos, right? It's in our generation, right?
Yeah, the mixture of creative music, but taking on sort of the American narrative is really,
Yeah,
it's fertile ground.
well, let me digress again because it's all a piece of history. But I had this idea of doing the first book of music, pre-1900, the Stephen Foster and the Revolutionary and Civil War themes and whatever. I had an idea of doing that. And again, trying to see if I could get a label in the early 90s to be able to pick it up, just as independent labels were closing, of course. I wanted to see if they do it, and I wanted to do it with my four-horn band. Well, I'll arrange these things, and this material is one of my friends in Germany who was a producer of festivals, who's now passed, Christian Kreck, he says, oh, it's Avant-Garde Oompa, the Four Horns band. And he says, oh, this would be a great program. 5 years later, he knew that I had had no success in pitching it and whatever. Bill Frisell is doing Americana and various people are doing. I mean, it's in the air, right? And all of a sudden he says, yeah, but Phil, I love this idea. He says, I want to help you do it. And he says, but I think you should use a string band. I said, what? He says, a string band. He says, like your roommate, Jim Yonda. And of course, I thought of Drew and Jim because we were already had a trio. And then I said, okay, but only if I can get Hank Roberts, and it will cost some money because I didn't know Hank personally yet. And of course, anyway, it takes money to do these things. And he says, okay, let's make it so. And his deal was he would help me make a couple of records with this band so that he would have first editions. He would help me press 500 copies, and he'd take 250 as business gifts to his business associates because he liked first editions. And he liked music that many people would like, that was accessible, and yet would draw them into one of his passions, jazz. Right? So that was the beginning of all this. And
Wow.
and I know I digressed. Remind me of where you wanted me to go with all this. I felt like I had to go back.
I got lost in your story.
Because it's this Americana idea. And because I found the right players, knowing that I needed somebody like Hank, I need to go with Jim. I had actually told Jim 3 years before this idea of free country came up. I said, Jim, you've been looking for a saxophonist or a trumpet or whatever to do a quartet of your music. I said, you need a cellist. He says, a what? I said, come here, Hank Roberts. You guys would be magic together. I listen for chemistry and I have a good batting average, but you never know until you do it. And then all of a sudden, that's why it was sitting there in front of me when Christian mentioned, oh, you should do it with a string band. What's more American than strings?
Fife and drum, maybe. That's about it.
And drums. Oh, that's right. That's right. Well, it just toggles everything that America is. It's got the European instruments. It's got the African rhythms, the trans-African rhythms and aesthetics. And then you got everything in our melting pot is right there.
Yeah.
It's folk music. And as you say, with jazz musicians, particularly my generation of jazz musicians who often are highly classically trained as well, all of a sudden there's just a lot of forces to bear. Again, can you find the true nuance in the music in an authentic way instead of just interpreting it? It was sort of like trying to get, years ago, it was, can you get strings to swing? Most of the time you couldn't, any more than you could get a jazz musician to play well in a classical context years ago. But of course, those things are changing. The American, as we look back on what it is to be American, and particularly in the last just few years, who would have ever believed before 2016 that our democracy might be this fragile, right? And you look back, and now all of a sudden we are forced, artists, everybody's forced to look back as like this great American experiment. And, we may have taken a lot for granted. I don't know about you, but, well, no, I do. Anybody who's alive today, Americans, was born into a privilege of being born into a country that just took for granted freedom of speech, due process, created equal under the law. All people were created equal. Wow. And our forebears not only enacted this, they fought to maintain it. And of course, theoretically, we realize that the fight's never over, but it's been easy-ish for too many of us for too many years. And now all of a sudden, who knew it was this fragile? And so back to Liberty Now. I'm just grateful we weren't tone deaf. You know, we
Well,
walked into that studio, and as it turned out, we actually had the makings of a protest record. And I didn't realize it until none of us realized it until 2 months later.
yeah, tell me about that. Were you, I would assume, although correct me if I'm wrong, you were in, your downtime or over meals or what have you. Everybody's seeing the news, hearing the news, processing the news. So it was in the air, right? Like, but there was not a conversation about overtly bringing it to the music. Tell me a little bit about that.
No, it's interesting because it's pretty much the first thing that you talk about when you get off the bandstand, right? Once you get past, I'm sorry, I missed your second ending. You know, that goes by pretty quickly. You're consumed with the grief about Herb. You're really consumed about the disbelief. You know, I think a lot of us thought that a piece of cardboard could have won the election from a centrist liberal side. And nope, wasn't true. I had this great illusion, and I think many of us did, when Obama was elected. I was surprised. I thought that we would have a woman or an Asian or whatever first before we had a black brother or a sister in office. And then we elected him a second time, rightfully, I thought. And it wasn't perfect, but gosh, it looked like we really, our country had maybe gotten past its adolescence. And maybe we were finally getting, even though we didn't have everything in a row, we were moving in the right direction. It's like, oh, we really have grown up. And then, of course, we watched what seems to be now, in retrospect, a backlash. Even though we knew that certain Southerners, certain people on the far right, not somewhat right, not the old right, but the radical right, never gave up the ideas of the Civil War. They believed in various things, white supremacy, what have you, and not taxing the wealthy at the same rates as the rest of us. Boy, that felt like it was un-American. And all of a sudden, those people who had been keeping their heads down because the culture, American culture, through about 2015 had been predominantly trying to find the better side of ourselves, working step by step, as well as to step backwards here and there, but, trying to bring out the better side of us. And then all of a sudden, those people found that it was okay to say outrageous or even hurtful things or worse in public. And just because you're able to blame somebody else for your problems or our problems, it made them feel better or something. Some change happened, and it was represented by this guy. We elected him twice too, apparently. And it never, well, I didn't see it coming. And I certainly, anyway, you could go on and on about the politics. It's just, and yes, it's the first thing on everybody's mind. What's interesting is that vulnerability that we talked about before is the kind of vulnerability that can be beautiful or can close you down. Artistically, I don't think we closed down. It was not an easy session. Took a lot of takes to get the one that I like. I like complete takes. And so, after a false take, we did 3 sets. We did a complete take of our originals. And, as soon as you got through the false take, if you had one, then as soon as you finished a take, you talk about what you liked, what you didn't like, and then you just moved on. Because I like albums that sound live. I like albums that sound real instead of tailored to within an inch of their lives. I like the old style records or aspects of them.
Yeah.
It was not an easy record, especially, it wasn't an easy record. And all of a sudden when I was producing, at the end and I'm looking at the takes, like, my God, there's nothing to choose from. It either has to be this take, or they don't exist, because we were hurting. Everybody was hurting. And it takes away from your attention span, but it also feeds you. Anyway, what I heard instantly was, oh my God, the pathos in losing Herb and this election, this disbelief, is in the music. It's in every take, and particularly in some of them.
Yeah.
It might have been hinted at by the themes and the harmonies, or the title, but now all of a sudden it's in there. Can you ask any more of artists? I mean, it's what we all dream of, right? Being able to communicate times and emotions and relevancy. And it became clear to me it was right. It's like, this a failed record, or is this, you actually have a work of art? You did really well. And then, so I took these and I put them in what I thought was the only sequence, that was, where it came to me pretty quickly. It's one of my superpowers, as they say. And I noticed, situation ethnics, pastime.
Oh, pastime's a great track.
Right. And it's like, we're in this time where every ethnicity, if you're not white, is under attack. And some people would have you look back to pastimes as if we had it together. And then I went on, and it was like my working title for Strands of Liberty was just Strands. And it became clear to me what it was about, because everybody has their own part. They're making up their melodic content. I only gave them the rhythms and the shape of their counterpoint. And you can hear the trying to make sense of this. And because of how I structured it compositionally, and then Jim's cadenza toward the end, you can hear it just come apart. And that's how it feels like when your liberties are questioned, you're losing control. And I couldn't believe that our band's collective subconscious and mine had all been working. It was as if it had been planned, and it was not. And yet there it was.
Can you tell me about the dialogue that the title Liberty Now is in with Max Roach's Freedom Now suite? If it is in dialogue, or maybe even I'll broaden the question. You add the exclamation point, which makes it a demand or a call, or it adds a
Insist.
yeah, that's right.
We insist.
Yeah, now. And I for the longest time I had a hard time understanding the definitional difference between freedom and liberty. And it's only been very recently that I finally grokked that freedom has to do with your ability to do what you want, and that liberty is the application of your freedom, the responsible application of your freedom, living with or living in freedom. Tell me about your word choices there, and tell me about, again, if it reflects at all into the Max Roach work.
Well, it absolutely reflects on Max's work. The 60s were our last social revolution, right? I had been saying since the 2000s, boy, when's our next, it's been 50 years. Like, it's kind of getting to be a long interval between social revolutions. And obviously, the raised brother fist, Freedom Now, Black Power, all of those things that were part of and parcel of the Black and the American experience in the 60s and Max's incredible work. Yeah, it's a landmark, right? It's one of those things that we as jazz musicians point to. And at the very least, let alone some other Americans, but certainly we point to.
Yeah.
And so Freedom Now didn't quite work. And we insist and whatever. And of course, I had this tune, Strands of Liberty. And the next two titles, by the way, in that sequence, right, on the album, Higgins and Diafana, and, anybody's name, it's confetti. One's rights, one's liberties are confetti. And so we were at a point, again, the collective unconsciousness was just crazy. And so I look at this and it's like, no, it's liberty now instead of freedom now, because, because as you say, you're trying to parse what your rights are versus your action in public and You're right, you're supposed to stop at the next guy's nose. And boy, is that big question lately. We need liberty and everything that it implies because we seem to be giving it away, I think, unexpectedly. Some people don't realize what's going on or they've been hoodwinked, and the rest of us are horrified that it can go this quickly. How is it that our courts, whoever thought the Senate would give up their power of the purse, right? I'm just saying, just for one, right? It's like, what? So anyway, I was thinking these things, and my social media, I'm sure would be a good piece of evidence against me. Many of us have been thinking this for a long time. Now the rules are changed. We grew up thinking and saying these things because we assumed we were born into freedoms of speech and due process and
all of it,
whatever, all of it. And the new rules, as of about 9 months ago, all of a sudden, 249 years of growing tradition and norms and all but thrown out the window. And it looks like it will only get worse. And history tells you it'll get worse unless something happens that we can't predict.
Yeah. I don't think Superman's coming.
No. And I don't think the rapture's coming either. And it's like we are at this point, this liberty now, unlike probably it's the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, the only time we're going to have to fight. We're going to have to find ways to rebuild an America that we can all be proud of and that stands up for mostly the good and is aspiring to be better. It's going to take a massive amount. And of course, it's above my pay grade to think I know, what it's going to take. But I do know that we have to spread the good to start with. And it starts with we have to be able to treat people in our family who we don't agree with religiously or politically. We have to bring them back in and reminding ourselves first, what are the things that we all believe in, and that those are more than our differences, and then get them to see that we're not on opposite sides. We have differing opinions, but we share the middle, right? Because consensus is one of the things that they're trying to say doesn't exist, right? It isn't valuable anymore. And that's maybe the cornerstone of democracy is finding consensus, that messy middle, right? It may not be efficient, but it keeps you from going too far one side or the other. So I don't know. It's a politically fraught time. It's hard to imagine if this goes on much longer that the next generation is going to have the opportunities that we did. And it's pretty easy to see that we, in our generations, those who are well into our careers and whatever, we're going to have fewer opportunities. It's hard not to face it. And oddly, it's in the music. Well, how could it not be in the music? That's the other side of it. And while it has all these political undertones, both meant and subconscious, there's also the side that it's just good music.
That's right. Which we need that too.
Oh, we need that so desperately.
There was something I wanted to ask you, but I'm going to skip ahead for 1 second just because you brought up a point that I was going to ask you about anyway, which is, you've spent a lot of time as an educator working with young people. What, if anything, do you tell young musicians about making art during times like this? And I guess the corollary to that would be, how, if at all, has your approach to teaching changed in this current environment? Is your messaging changing? What's it like being around all these young faces who, to the point you just made, like they're looking at a much different world than you and I were looking at? I mean, we were spoiled.
We were. You're probably going to have to remind me of that question midway a couple of times because it's just, it's a pregnant question.
Yeah.
First, on the one hand, I would say that my message isn't changed much in that at least what I have been teaching, what I learned from my masters and they learned from their masters, was you have to be true to yourself first. Oh, Paul Smoker had this great, it may not be original, but he had this great quote. He said, you need to know something about everything and everything about something.
That's great.
Be a well-educated person. You need to know something about everything and everything about something. And of course, it's a goal. It's not possible, right? It's impossible, but it's like, if you know a little something about everything, it gives you some greater perspective. And if you are a specialist and you are an authority in some area, that has great value, or has had great value for our culture for a very long time. As an artist, it means if you're an expert, and you really are a great artist in this case, it means that you have managed to you managed to condense and purify. You've recognized your inner child, to take that terrible, overused term, but you know who you are, or it sounds like you're being honest with yourself. What I tell students is, if I teach a singer-songwriter, it's like I had one that just came in this semester, and I listened, had her read her lyrics first before she read the title, and then read her lyrics to me before I asked her to sing. And I said, "Oh, it's autobiographical." And anyway, anything that I would say was this surprise, and it's like, well, it's the best thing you can write about is things from your experience, right? Which is kind of what else can we write from, right? Well, you can imagine things, but it generally has more power. We have more sensory information to compute and communicate through our music if we've experienced it ourselves. And so I always tell them, write what you know. Of course it's power. This is working. This is great. You got to need to leave enough breadcrumbs so that if you're going to make me listen to your lyric 4, 5, 6, 7 times, like a good piece of poetry, not everything is understandable the first time. If you're going to make me listen to it that many times to get your meaning, it better be great. Otherwise, you got to not be quite so subtle. Let us know. Give us enough to go on so that, oh, I see. Oh, because I need to identify with it. We all need to identify ourselves in you and your experience. That's what an artist does, at least what we aspire to. On the other hand, it was the reaction in Free Country was we were just grateful we weren't tone deaf. And it would not have been as heavy if we had gone in saying we were going to make this protest record. It was just like a little over 10 years ago. It happened to be, we were recording 60, 69, and the Coltrane Suite was last, and we started recording it. We just finished with might have been all of it or part of it from A Love Supreme and Resolution. And Drew said, do you know it's this week to the day? Well, actually, yeah, it's this week that A Love Supreme was recorded 50 years ago. If we had known that going in, we would have failed. Just too much, right? Too much. But then there are these interesting coincidences. And the same thing happened 50 years ago, as it turned out. If you live long enough, you get to see these things, these weird coincidences that feel spiritual and sound spiritual, as it turns out. 50 years after I first got my first 2 jazz records, Elvin Jones, Merry-Go-Round, and who's on that record? I think it's the first with Dave Liebman. He's a young guy. And it's the first that I have. And I got it the week before Christmas. And it was exactly the week before Christmas, 50 years later, that we recorded Codas. I'm sure the last time that Dave recorded anybody's original music, because it was so difficult, because he was having his issues. And yet the music that comes out is wow. And, if you can't make that stuff up, and it does feel spiritual, even though it's just a coincidence.
What?
Or you start to wonder why people believe certain things. Well, okay, I'm a spiritualist because I've had a lot of wild things happen, and it wasn't on, I don't know that I'm very religious, but I'm quite spiritual because I am constantly in awe of, maybe it's as little as coincidences. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. As a rationalist, you can only go where the evidence points you. And if you go where the evidence points you, it's going to lead you sometimes to not rational places, which is okay.
Yeah, some of my early spiritual experiences were deja vu. I would dream things literally, in the middle of the night and not think about them. And then 6 months later, that very situation would happen, or 2 years later, that very situation would happen. And for me, what happened was I never had control over it, but the dream informed me of I could make one decision or another, and I didn't know where. I only knew what one path would do. And that was why that happened into my 30s, before that strange piece of spiritual wackiness, nonsensical, nonlinear time whatever passed for me, but to not be so quick to dismiss things that others believe, especially if you can tell it's coming from an earnest place, not just a learned place, but not something that they're parroting. No.
Yeah.
This is their experience. So the message hasn't changed. And yet, on the other hand, you're living, I would say, the other hand is you talk to that student and it's like, you are living through these times. What does it make you feel like? What is it? It's clearly got stress on them. What's it feel? What do you want? And say, if you're true to yourself and you use your art to help yourself, to feed your own soul so that you can grapple with your own feelings and whatever, maybe if you get good enough at distilling it, like a good poem, others will find resonance in it. And
put that in the art.
And fortunately, people who have that, more people have that ability than you think. It's just they don't meet the right people at the right time to help them. It seems like they just find me at Bucknell. So where do these kids come from? Sort of self-select or something. They find their way to my little studio down in the basement.
That's funny.
It is funny.
I wanted to turn back to the record for a moment. Something that landed for me earlier today was the way you've constructed the album with the new material and then the second disc of what I would call curated material from throughout Free Country's catalog. It's kind of like listening to a Ken Burns movie. And it occurred to me that maybe you guys should be talking to Ken Burns, but that's another topic. I wonder if you could tell me about, you said earlier that one of your superpowers is in the sequencing of a record. And that seems to be something you're channeling and bringing to bear, right? In this collection, let's call it a collection, this set. What was going on there? And what were the through lines you were trying to bring to the surface for listeners?
Well, at first, there's just a simple craft thing. It's sort of like, okay, I have this album of new material, and I thought it was strong, but it was also, as you say, vulnerable. It alluded to the theme of Liberty Now, but the band over 28 some years, almost 30 years, had actually been hitting it on the nail, 1 or 2, 3 pieces an album. As I said, it had always been a politically aware band. It's like, and lots of arguments. We can't say that. We have to say this. You can't interpret it that way, whatever. I mean, and so I felt like, a lot of people probably don't know the back catalog of this band, and that's too bad. If reviewers are paying attention, they didn't miss No Fast Food. They now haven't missed the Four Horn Band, but they might have missed Free Country for a variety of reasons. And it's like, well, I'm not going to put out a 7-disc set retrospective. That's just not going to get listened to. All of a sudden, it was like, here's this album that alludes to Liberty Now. I can take 1, 2, 3 tracks from each of our earlier records and make a compilation that underlines it.
Yeah.
That shows our originals, which we did for the first time last December. That's a kind of liberty, right? That we find our freedom in we have the ability to do our own material. But we, as you alluded to, we chiseled it and crafted it from covers of Americana from the Revolutionary War through the 60s through today. And so I wanted to make sure that even though it's big, 2 CDs, wow, it's a lot to, either one is a lot to listen to.
Yeah.
This band didn't just go blink and make one nice record. It's because this is the 4th studio record and the 5th recording overall, because we did a live record. We've been on this and we've actually hit it. And I, again, was amazed to look back and, something like as innocent as She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain and she'll be wearing red pajamas and white horses. And of course, we had performed it like a train running out of control, getting faster and faster. And it's just like, oh no, this has to be there. Not just because it's fun, but as it turns out, that silly old song actually has resonance now. Maybe it wasn't intended at the time, but it's got resonance now. We think of red pajamas and we know what that means. We think of white horses in the apocalypse. So I was like, Jesus, I was like, holy cow. So anyway, if some of it was just the craft of, I would never put a 7 CD set on somebody, but there's a bunch of people, if they're attracted and curious about the band after they hear the new material, they ought to be able to have a primer, here, take this. And you can see that the band was good throughout. It just has gotten more this, that, and the other thing. And it certainly has had a political consciousness. And that's when, you realize, no, that's the right approach, because that underlines the sort of Max Roach, we insist, it's like,
Yeah.
check it out. And one reviewer was kind enough already to say, it doesn't tell you what freedom is, takes you through all these emotions and landscapes, just like real life. It's no one, freedom is not one thing, but it asks you to ask yourself, let alone your nation, what is liberty? What is freedom? What is it to be American? As a result, even though we may not have freedom of speech and due process guaranteed much longer, and many have already had it stripped, here we go. It's worth holding on for. And I think, a lot of us have to, it's like the conversation about anti-fascists, Antifa. Well, I think President and General Eisenhower was the head of Antifa, right? That's the Antifa I know. I don't believe in burning buildings, but guess what? In World War II, we had to. I don't believe in war, but I can't say you didn't have to stop Hitler. I just, I don't know where it's going, but I do know you have to stop. We have to not just raise red signs, but pass on the good, build community, starting with your family and your neighbors, hold your representatives' feet to the fire, and, especially when truth and facts are under siege and being gaslit. Not all, but most of those people know that they're lying. Most of those people know that they're selling us the street for the worst of the billionaire class. I'm not saying that all billionaires are bad, but there's a side of a capitalism that is just beyond, it's horrific, as well as all the good things that it has brought us. And when it's not regulated, we know what happens. We've got history. So anyway, I don't know. It's so overwhelming. It's such an overwhelming time. And how can we not stick our hands up and say something? And even when we weren't trying to say something, the whole band was like relieved that we weren't tone deaf.
You'll come back, right? We'll do this again.
Yes, and we'll have to, because you're going to have to edit out so much stuff. I'm free associating and emotional venting. It's just. But I do believe. People would say I really can't talk about it. It just drives me crazy. And it's like most of us need to be able to talk about it so it doesn't become like a pressure cooker and explodes. But you have to let off the steam and make sure that the other person's okay, even though none of us are okay.
Thank you so much, Phil Haynes. And as always, thank you for tuning into the Tonearm. If you enjoyed this conversation, I bet you'll like at least one more from the nearly 300 episodes available in our free episode archive at thetonearm.com. While you're there, join our mailing list, or please consider becoming a paid supporter. The Tonearm is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant, and our theme music is by Birdie, spelled B-U-R-D-Y. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe and stay in touch.